1. Katarzyna Zawada. Some of the names have only been disclosed as initials due to Polish privacy laws. On a cold winter morning on January 7, 1999, Miroslaw M., a tugboat operator, opened a hatch on the Los, a barge pusher on the Vistula, to remove what was stuck in the propeller since last evening. He expected to find a tire or a tree branch, but what he saw was something different. He wondered what the object was, of nondescript, pale color and sack-like appearance, when he felt a foul smell and noticed a human ear. As it later turned out, what M. found were the remains of 23-year-old religion knowledge student, Katarzyna Zawada. Specifically, her skin, neatly cut away at the thighs and neck, reaching only as far as the left ear, without the face and arms. Her nipples were also absent. There was an oblique seam going from under the right breast to the left shoulder. The coroner said the body had been in the water for about 2 or 3 weeks before she was found. Pieces of her sweater were also at the scene. A week later, Katarzyna's leg was found near a hydroelectric dam also on the Vistula, among some floating litter and tree branches. No other remains of her have ever been found. Some of her clothes have, pieces of jeans and a flannel shirt with a square cutout. Katarzyna had been missing since November 12, 1998. She was a loner, who had few friends, always sat alone during lectures, and lived with her mother. She had depression and, at one point in the past, had tried to commit suicide. Her mother became worried when she didn't show up to a doctor's appointment to which they were going to go together. It was discussed that it was a copycat murder based on Silence of the Lambs. The police were doing their best, since the profilers stated there was a high possibility that it was only the first in a series of murders. And indeed, the next murder happened. On May 31st, around 1 p.m., the Krakow police received a phone call. An elderly man said there was a murder at his house in a tiny village near the city and he believed his grandson was the murderer. In the house's basement, a corpse was hanging upside down from the ceiling. The victim, a 50-year-old man, had been beheaded and the skin of his head and face was found at the scene. It was sewn to form a mask. The head was found outside the house. The murderer was a Russian immigrant, Vladimir W. The victim, his father Whitledge. Interrogation revealed even more shocking details. Vladimir wore his father's face and clothes for a whole day and pretended to be him in front of his grandfather, who didn't see very well. The motive, he said, was the hatred he felt towards his father after he cheated on his wife and left her with nothing in Nauczyk, Russia, to pursue a new life in Poland with his son and father. It is possible that Vladimir knew Kasia. They both studied psychology on the Uniwersytet Jagiellonski, albeit they weren't in the same class. He started in 1992, she did in 1993, but dropped out after a year. He did not confess to killing her. He is currently spending his 25-year sentence in a Russian jail. In Krakow, there have only been 3 cases ever of someone being skinned after death. The last one happened in 1983. Jan N., a perfectly normal citizen, one day decided to murder and skin his wife and teenage son. He then tried to dispose of the bodies by tossing them into the Vistula piece by piece. He was arrested before he completed his plan and committed to a mental institution indeterminately. His poor physical health led to him being granted parole during the time of Katarzyna's death, but the police determined he couldn't have done that for the above reason. Investigation revealed that Katarzyna skipped her classes for 2 weeks before the disappearance. In fact, she disappeared during one of these truancies. She was supposed to go to the doctor's right after class. This points to the possibility of a secret relationship. Her friends only knew of one male friend, a fellow Grateful Dead fan whom she had met at an event where people sold each other used music CDs and cassettes. He had an alibi. In 2000, DNA belonging to another person was discovered on Kasia's skin. It was compared to all the suspects and persons of interest in the case, including known sexual offenders, but to no avail. The case was reopened in 2012. Traces of relatively rare plant species were found on the sweater, which the police believe could pinpoint the location of the crime. Also, it has been revealed that Katarzyna has been tortured before death. Revealed. 2. The silent twins. In fiction there are lots of scary twins, just think of those creepy little girls in The Shining. In the real world, most twins consider themselves lucky to have a companion who shares their genes and their history. But for some twins, Like Jennifer and June Gibbons, that unique bond becomes more of a curse. In the end, June and Jennifer decided one of them would have to die so the other one could go on living. It was an investigative journalist for the Sunday Times named Marjorie Wallace who first brought their story to the world. She befriended the girls in 1980, chronicling their strange connection and its stranger end in her 1986 biography The Silent Twins. The girls were born in 1963 to Barbadian parents and grew up in a small town in Wales called Haverfordwest. June was born first, but it was Jennifer who developed into the stronger, more dominant one. In fact, one medical expert said it seemed like Jennifer at times possessed her sister. Even the girls themselves described themselves as switching selves, bouncing back and forth between being Jennifer and being June. Their lives did not begin happily. They were the only black children in their town and the ostracism and bullying was so severe school officials allowed them to leave ahead of the other students so they could reach home in peace. They responded by withdrawing into their own world. They stopped speaking to anyone else. They communicated only with each other in a private language only they could understand. A close study of their speech revealed it was a rapid-fire mashup of English and Barbadian slang. Therapists decided separating the girls might force them to re-enter the world. It didn't work. The girls were sent to separate boarding schools where they retreated into full-blown catatonia, neither speaking nor moving. When they were reunited, they retreated to their bedroom, refusing even to come out for meals. But they used their imaginations to build a huge world in that small space. They invented complicated names and stories for their dolls. The fantasies included a certain ghoulishness, with the demise of the dolls recorded in an official notebook, each with a specific cause of death. They were now 16 and surviving on public assistance. They chronicled their lives in detail in separate diaries. Those diaries record a heartbreaking transition in their relationship. Instead of finding comfort in their closeness, they began to turn on each other. We have become fatal enemies in each other's eyes, Jennifer writes. I say to myself, can I get rid of my own shadow? Impossible or not possible. Without my shadow, would I die? Without my shadow, would I gain life, be free or left to die? One entry from June, she wants us to be equal. There is a murderous gleam in her eye. Dear Lord, I am scared of her. She is not normal. Someone is driving her insane. It is me. They began writing novels. Again, the subjects were dark. An American boy addicted to Pepsi Cola who was seduced by his teacher. Another boy whose surgeon father transplanted a dog's heart into his body. Their dark fantasies led to dark behaviors. They started drinking and using drugs. They broke into houses, smashed windows, and started fires. That behavior led eventually to their arrest. They were committed to the infamous Broadmoor Hospital, the high-security prison mental hospital where some of Britain's most notorious serial killers were sent to live out their lives. In her biography, Wallace reports that in Broadmoor the twins decided one of them would have to die so the other could live. Jennifer, the stronger twin, agreed to be the sacrifice in this fatal pact. The girls endured Broadmoor Hospital for 11 years. When they were nearly 30, they were finally released to a less restrictive hospital in Wales. On the bus to their new home, Jennifer laid her head on June's shoulder and said, "At long last, we're out." That night Jennifer died. The cause of death was an undiagnosed infection of the heart. June was released from the hospital a year later. In 2000, The New Yorker's Hilton ALS traveled to Wales to meet her. In his article, he describes a normal woman living a normal, if lonely, life. She was in a halfway house when ALS visited, but has since moved to her own apartment. And she visits her sister's grave often. It is inscribed with a poem written by June. We once were two. We two made one, we no more two, through life be one, rest in peace. 3. The disappearance of Brandon Swanson. 19-year-old Brandon Swanson lived in Marshall, Minnesota with his parents. On the night of May 14, 2008, after celebrating the last day of college classes with a friend, he was driving home along a gravel road, and somehow crashed his car into a ditch. Unable to move it himself and get back onto the road, he called home at some time after midnight, and asked his parents to pick him up near Lind, a small town southwest of Marshall. His parents left the house and began driving to pick up Brandon, at the same time speaking with him on his mobile phone to determine exactly where he was. After getting to the location which he had described, They started flashing the car's headlights so that Brandon could start walking towards them. Brandon told them he couldn't see the lights at all, so he got back into his car and started flashing his own headlights in the hope that maybe they would see him. His parents said that they couldn't anything either. Both sides got increasingly frustrated, and Brandon eventually said that he was going to start walking towards the town of Lind, to a friend's house. He said that he knew which direction to head in as he could see what looked like the lights of a town. His father dropped Brandon's mother back at home, then began driving again to find his son. At around 2 a.m. Brandon and his father were on the phone to each other, with Brandon desperately trying to direct his father to where he was, and Brandon's father equally desperately trying to locate his son. 47 minutes into the phone call, Brandon suddenly exclaimed, "Oh shit!" And the line went dead. And that was the last time anybody heard anything from Brandon Swanson. His dad tried calling back a number of times, but Brandon never picked up his phone. His frantic parents continued the search but were unable to find him. A few hours later, at around 6:30 am, they notified the police. Since that day, more than 500 volunteers have spent over 120 days looking for Brandon, or any evidence pointing to where he could be, covering over 100 square miles in the process. This has included over 30 dog handlers from 9 different states. The result? No evidence, no clues, nothing. The only thing that has ever been found is Brandon's car, which was discovered around 20 miles away from where he told his parents he thought he crashed. The authorities say that there is neither any evidence of foul play, nor any evidence that Brandon would have staged his own disappearance. They have also said that they do not believe there was any evidence that he was intoxicated or impaired in any way. And if he was drunk, for instance, then it's likely that his parents would have picked up on this over the phone. The authorities received over 75 tips about Brandon, but none have borne any information that has led anywhere near to finding him. The last official search was conducted in October 2011. And age-progressed photos have also been distributed in the hope that somebody may recognize him. There have been a number of theories around what happened that night, with the most prevalent being that Brandon must have fallen into a river or creek, possibly the Yellow Medicine River, which is 15 feet at its deepest point, and would have been running incredibly fast at the time he disappeared. The problem with this theory, however, is that there would be some trace if he had fallen in. And so far nothing has been found at any point of the river. A number of other theories have been considered, including the idea that Brandon might have hidden in an abandoned structure to escape the cold and then succumbed to hypothermia, or that he was attacked by an animal and taken away. Yet again, the main problem with these theories is that of evidence, or, more specifically, the big fat lack of it. If for instance he did hide in a structure, then surely it would have been found by now. Not to mention the fact that an animal attacking, fatally wounding and then dragging a person away would leave a huge amount of evidence behind. Yet more theories are that Brandon was either hit by a car or picked up by an apparently helpful driver who turned out to have a malicious intent. These theories have major flaws. However, if a person has time to register danger, swear down the phone and then end a phone call, surely they would have time to get out of the way of an oncoming vehicle? And if he was picked up by someone, surely he would tell his dad, who he was on the phone with at the time. Also, if someone had just offered to give him a lift home, why would he swear at all? On the subject of the phone call, a huge question here is why the phone call was ended. If something dangerous was imminent, it seems unlikely that Brandon would actually hang up the phone. He would be more likely to drop the phone, and his parents would then hear anything that was going on, such as a struggle, or the whooshing of the river, or the impact of a car. But instead somebody pushed end on the phone. As has been asked so many times in this case, why? An answer might be that Brandon dropped the phone, causing the battery to fall out and so ending the call that way. However, Brandon's dad said that after the call ended, he kept trying to call Brandon but that he wasn't picking up the call, which means the phone was in working condition but not being answered. At time of writing, 6 years later, there is still no evidence or even a trace indicating what happened. In spite of all the searches using state-of-the-art equipment and techniques, and all of the theories and hours of investigations and searches, we are still no closer to knowing what occurred that night, or where Brandon Swanson is now. Just as with the case of Elisa Lam in Los Angeles, there seem to be more questions than answers. Impossible as it may seem, A 19-year-old man seems to have, literally, disappeared without a trace. 4. Tarada. Tara was a 13-year-old girl living in Campden, Israel. In 2006, she was found stabbed to death in a stall in the girls' bathroom at the school she studied at. One of the suspects was Roman Zaradov, an immigrant from Ukraine who was doing a tiling job at the school. As the doc states, someone from the school thought the school gardener had suspicious behavior on the day of the murder, but when he had an alibi, they looked at Roman, because he looked like the gardener. Roman couldn't speak Hebrew properly and had an illegal work permit to stay in the country. The proposed motive for Roman murdering Tara was that he was frustrated for not being able to be a part of society in this foreign country. Tara said something to him that made him angry at her, and he unleashed that frustration on her. While being questioned by the police, the investigators told him that there was evidence connecting him to the crime scene in the bathroom, even though that was a lie. Roman said, multiple times, that was impossible, but after the investigators insisted he started giving in, saying that if he did do something he couldn't remember. While in custody, the police kept him in a cell with an undercover guy, who was there to make him confess. He was successful. Roman confessed and reenacted the murder at the school with the police. The doc shows that some of the parts of the reenactment were a little bit forced by the police to fit the story of the murder. Roman was convicted and sentenced to life for the murder of Tara, even though there was still no evidence connecting him to it. Tara's mother is not convinced Roman killed her daughter, and expressed that she always thought other girls who were Tara's classmates did it. Facebook groups were created, saying that 2 specific girls were responsible for the murder. These 2 girls, Lee and Nofar, speak at the documentary. They say they testified to the police saying they went to the bathroom in the time frame that the murder occurred. Lee knocked on the stall's door that Tara was murdered and heard a girl's voice saying it was occupied. According to her, the police kept asking questions if she was sure it was a girl, if it couldn't have been a man's voice, as they had Roman as a suspect. And she said it could have been a man's voice. Nofar testified that she saw a girl with curled hair in the bathroom that she had never seen before or after the murder. In one of those Facebook groups that were attacking Lee and Nofar, one fake profile started defending the girls. This happened 7 years after the murder. Lee sent a message thanking the person for defending them, and this person replied saying he was a coward as he knew who committed the murder but never said anything to the police. This guy is called by his initials, AH, and he reports that on the day of the murder, his girlfriend told him she had committed a murder at the school she went to, same school Tara's murder happened. The girlfriend, AK, then showed him a backpack with clothes soaked in blood, a knife, gloves and a wig with curls. AH also said that AK had violent fantasies and behavior and thought she was a she-wolf trapped in a human's body. He got a lawyer and was questioned by the police, who then questioned AK. She said he was frustrated because they had ended things, that he was the one who was violent, had raped her and had blood fantasies. He does not deny the abuse on the documentary. Then, after these interrogations, in 2013, AK goes to AH's house to attack him with a shard of glass. People who heard the altercation called the police, and when the police arrives, AK tried to take a bite of the policeman's neck. She later says that she was hungry for the good stuff. AK had left the house that day with a knife, and records show that before Tara's murder, she had been arrested with a hunting knife on her. They questioned her after this incident where she attacked AH and the policeman. She says that she loves blood, is fascinated with and wants to pull out the insides of people. When police asks her if she has done this before, she says she doesn't want to talk about it. Later on, she says it's hard work murdering people, taking stuff out and breathing it and touching it. After this questioning, she was committed to psychiatric treatment. AH was arrested for obstruction of justice and for the sexual assault of A.K, but was released after 11 days. Police wanted to make him retract his statement about Tara's murder, even saying they would nullify the sexual assault charges on him if he retracted. He didn't. His statement was presented in court on an appeal for Roman, but it was ruled inadmissible. Another interesting thing, one of A.K.'s roommates, who committed suicide in 2015, told a friend, Mapalik, that A.K. said once that she tried to kill someone but was caught. However, there was another time she wasn't caught. She then described this incident as Tara's murder. 2 days after May told this in a phone call to the doc people, "I think she killed herself." She was a transgender activist, and had already paid for her own cremation and had vowed to kill herself. Kay's DNA was tested against samples from under Tara's nails, but it had already been known that there was no unknown DNA there. She has already been released from the psychiatric hospital. So, guys, what do you think? I find it hard to believe that Roman is really guilty, but it's difficult to trust and believe AH and AK with no evidence, and as it looks like they're not the most stable people ever. 5. The Unsolved Hinterkaifeck. March 31, 1922, 5 members of the Gruber family and their maid were murdered on their farm. Over the next 4 days, the killer remained in their home, using the fireplace, cooking and eating the family's food, and even fed and milked the cattle. To this day, no one knows for sure who is responsible for the Hinterkaifeck murders. The Hinterkaifeck farmstead was located near the woods outside the Bavarian town of Grobern, and a half-mile behind, or Hinter, the town of Kaifeck, thus its name, Hinterkaifeck. This farm was home to 35-year-old Victoria Gabriel, her 2 children, Cazelia, 7, Joseph, 2, and her elderly parents, Andreas and Cazelia Gruber. Victoria's husband was said to have perished in the war, WWI. While the family had a tendency to keep to themselves, neighbors became concerned when, on Saturday, April 1, 1922, Cazelia failed to show up for school and the family did not attend church, where Victoria was a member of the choir. When Monday came and Cazelia still did not show up at school, people began to talk. That's when they discovered that mail was beginning to pile up at the local post office, which was very unusual. On April 4, Lawrence Schlittenbauer, a farmer who lived close to the Gruber family, led a search party, and what they discovered was a grisly scene. 4 members of the Gruber family were found inside the barn, brutally beaten and covered with hay. Upon investigating inside the home, they found the body of 2-year-old Joseph, and the maid, Maria Baumgartner. Maria's body was covered with a sheet, while the body of Joseph was covered with one of his mother's dresses. Autopsies were conducted by court physician Dr. Johann Baptist Hommler. Andreas Gruber's face was caked with blood, and his cheekbones protruded from the marred flesh. His wife, Cazelia, showed signs of strangulation in addition to having sustained 7 blows to the head, which left her with a cracked skull. Victoria's skull had also been smashed, and the right side of her face had been struck with a blunt object. She also had 9 star-shaped wounds on her head. Victoria's daughter, 7-year-old Cazelia, had a shattered lower jaw. Upon further investigation, gaping circular wounds were found covering her face and neck. Based upon the wounds sustained, the physician was able to determine that Andreas, his wife Cazelia, and daughter Victoria likely died instantly. The murder weapon? A mattock, a pickaxe-like tool with a broad adze, horizontal blade, on one end, and a pick or axe on the other end, that was used for chopping. 7-year-old Cazelia was not as fortunate as her mother. She likely remained alive for several hours after her attack, cold, beaten, and laying in the barn among her dead family. Her hair had been ripped out in large clumps, which were found clutched in her hands. Maria Baumgartner, the maid, and little Joseph were also killed with blows to the head, Maria with crosswise strikes to the head, and Joseph with a heavy blow to the face. No harm came to the farm animals, or the family Pomeranian watchdog. In fact, the animals had been taken care of and fed for several days after the murder. Who would carry out such a brutal act of violence? Police initially suspected vagrants, however this theory was quickly thrown out as large sums of money were found inside the house, and nothing else appeared to have been taken, aside from food the killer ate, and firewood the killer burned. Neighbors reported that Andreas had confided in them about strange happenings just before he was killed. He found a newspaper, that he did not purchase, in his home. He also found a set of footsteps set in pristine and unmarked snow, leading in only one direction, from the forest into the farmstead. One set of the family's keys disappeared, and strange sounds came from the attic. Even Victoria reported seeing a stranger in an army coat watching their farmhouse. When she tried to approach him, he disappeared into the woods. Combine all of these with the fact that the killer remained in the home for days after the murder, and police began to suspect that an intruders had taken up residence in the house prior to killing the family. With no suspects, police began to look at several men who were in some way connected to the family. Victoria's husband had died during WWI, yet she still had a son, Joseph. No one knew, or even now knows for certain, who the father of this child was. Some suspect it was Lawrence Schlittenbauer. He and Victoria had both publicly referred to Joseph as their child. They were in a relationship and planned to get married, until Victoria's father, Andreas, interfered. Lawrence went on to make a formal statement declaring that Andreas was Joseph's father, and Andreas was arrested and held in custody for 2 weeks. Lawrence withdrew his statement, causing Andreas to be released. He later claimed he only did so because Victoria's family paid him to do so. Lawrence went on to marry another woman who gave birth to his baby, but that child died just weeks later. Lawrence was also the nearby neighbor who happened to lead the search party that discovered the bodies. Those with him during the initial search found his behavior to be suspicious and reported it to authorities. They claimed he acted nonchalant. He was able to view and handle the bodies of the dead without any signs of repulsion. It was also suspicious that he knew his way around the farm. Taking this lead, police began to theorize that Lawrence was traumatized by the death of his own child and had gone to the farm to murder Victoria and her family. Police questioned Lawrence extensively but were never able to place him conclusively at the scene of the crime and explained away his odd behavior as him being in shock. They also reasoned that he knew the farm well because of his relationship with Victoria. Another theory was that little Joseph was the child of Victoria and her father, Andreas, and that one of them had killed the entire family before turning the matter on themselves. It was no secret that Andreas and Victoria had had an incestuous relationship. From the time Victoria was 16, Andreas had repeatedly raped her. In 1914, she attempted to escape her father's clutches by marrying Carl Gabriel, but her father insisted that the couple continued to live at Hinterkaifeck. In August of that year, Carl Gabriel went on to join the army, and by December the family was informed that Carl was missing in action, and presumed dead as his body was never recovered. Victoria gave birth the following month, and while Carl was officially the father, Andreas took it upon himself to be named Casilia's legal guardian. Many suspect he was truly responsible for that little girl. In May 1915, a servant caught Andreas raping Victoria, and she went to the police. Both Andreas and Victoria were charged with incest. Andreas serving a 1-year prison sentence, Victoria serving 1 month. After his release, Andreas continued on, as though nothing had ever happened. Victoria was still her father's sexual slave and she tried to escape it with her relationship with Lawrence Schlittenbauer. When Victoria came up pregnant, Lawrence insisted the child couldn't be his, that it was her father's child. Andreas and Lawrence got into a heated argument, where Andreas ultimately threatened Lawrence with a scythe. Andreas forbade the marriage, and Lawrence agreed. This theory was convincing, until it was determined that none of the injuries sustained by any member of the Gruber family, or even Maria Baumgartner, could have been self-inflicted. Police moved on to yet another suspect, Carl Gabriel. They theorized that Carl hadn't actually died in the war, and came back to find his wife had had another child, that was clearly not his. In a jealous rage, he killed the entire family, including his daughter, Casilia, believing she wasn't even his. Police threw this theory out when it was reported that Carl Gabriel had been slain in France, and many of his fellow soldiers claimed to have seen his body. However, to this day, no body has been produced as having been Carl Gabriel. The final theory was that their deaths were caused by a ghost. The maid, Maria Baumgartner, had just started work on the day she died. She was hired to replace the Gruber's former maid, who had quit unexpectedly. The former maid believed the house had been haunted. The former maid reported hearing constant sounds coming from the attic, yet no one was up there. She said she felt as though she were being watched, yet she never saw anyone when she looked. The heads of the Gruber family, and the maid, were all cut off and sent to Munich for further examination. Clairvoyants were called, yet the skulls refused to speak to them. No new metaphysical clues were produced, and this theory was thrown out as well. In 1923, the farm was demolished, a shrine left in its place. All 6 victims were then buried without their heads. Unfortunately, their skulls were lost during the chaos of Wei, in Weihofen. There, A memorial stands to remember the tragedy at Hinterkaifeck. In the years since, the case has been reopened multiple times, most recently in 2007. Students of the Unexplained Police Academy in Fürstenfeldbruck examined the case using modern criminal investigation techniques. They concluded that it is impossible to definitively solve the crime after so much time had passed. The primitive investigation techniques available at the time of the murders yielded little evidence, and in the decades since the murders, evidence has been lost and suspects have since died. Despite these setbacks, the students did establish a prime suspect, but did not name the suspect out of respect for still living relatives. 6. The Campden Wonder. The market town of Chipping Campden, nestled near the Cotswold Hills, was the quintessential quaint little English village. It was a quiet, out-of-the-way place, largely overlooked by the outside world. It would be completely anonymous, if not for the fact that in the 17th century, it was the site of one of the most baffling episodes in criminal history, popularly known as the Campden Wonder. The story opens on August 16, 1660. On that day, an elderly steward named William Harrison set out to collect rent money owed to his employer, Juliana Hicks, Victus Campden. Harrison headed towards Charingworth, a village about 2 miles away. It was expected that he would not be gone for long, so when by the end of the day, Harrison had yet to return, his wife became alarmed and sent his servant, John Perry, out to search for him. By the following morning, both men were still absent, so Harrison's son Edward ventured out to see what was amiss. Along the road to Charingworth he met Perry, who told him of his failure to find any trace of William. When they made inquiries in the neighboring village of Ebrington, they were told that Harrison had been there the evening before, calling on a man named Edward Plaisterer, after which he set out on the road to Campden. That was the last anyone had seen of William Harrison. However, an ominous clue regarding his disappearance soon emerged. On a lonely road between Ebrington and Campden, Harrison's hat and collar band were found, torn and bloodstained. The immediate assumption was that the old man was waylaid, robbed, and murdered. A search was made throughout the countryside for his body, but no further trace of him was discovered. Everyone's prime suspect in Harrison's presumed murder was John Perry. The place where Harrison's belongings were found was just where the servant would have met Harrison on his return from Ebington. Perry would have known his master was carrying a large sum of money from his rent collecting. And why did Perry stay out all night, rather than returning to Campden when his search for Harrison proved futile? Perry was quickly arrested and brought before a justice of the peace for questioning. The story he gave was this: on the night of Harrison's disappearance, he walked towards Charingworth. Along the way, he met an acquaintance named William Reed. As Perry was nervous about walking alone on the Stark Road at night, he returned with Reed to Campden. He started out again, in the company of someone named Pierce, but after going only a short distance, went back to his village. He took shelter in Lady Campden's hen roost until about midnight, when the moon rose. The moonlight gave him the nerve to resume his search. However, a fog developed that caused him to lose his way. He spent the rest of the night under a bridge. At dawn, he went to Charingworth, where he made a number of inquiries about his master, with little success. On his return home, he met Edward Harrison. Although Reed, Pierce, and Plaisterer were able to confirm at least their parts of Perry's story, the authorities were not at all convinced of the suspect's innocence, and he remained in custody. After about a week, Perry asked to see the justice. He had, he claimed, something to say to him that he would not disclose to anyone else. As it turned out, Perry wished to confess to William Harrison's murder, and he named his mother, Joan Perry, and his brother Richard as instigators of the evil deed. According to his account, Joan and Richard were constantly nagging him to join them in robbing his master when Harrison returned from a round of rent collecting. Finally, he agreed. On the fatal day when Harrison set out for Charingworth, John tipped off Richard about the errand. That evening, when his mistress ordered him to look for Harrison, the brothers Perry set out together. When they spotted Harrison walking through a field, John told Richard that if he followed him he might have his money. The squeamish John then went off to walk a turn in the fields. When he returned, he saw Harrison lying on the ground, with Joan and Richard standing over him. He heard William moan, "Ah, rogues! Will you kill me?" John begged his relatives to spare the old man's life. Richard responded with a contemptuous, "Peace, peace, you are a fool." He then strangled Harrison to death. Richard took Harrison's bag of money from the corpse. The Perrys then carried the body over to a nearby cesspool. John again timorously left the scene. He said he assumed his mother and brother dumped the body in the cesspool, but he could not say for sure what they did with Harrison's remains. He then went back to town, where he met Pierce and walked with him towards Charingworth. John then returned to the hen roost, where he cut Harrison's hat and collar with a knife and threw them into the road. Berry added that his brother had also been responsible for a burglary of Harrison's house which had occurred the previous year. After this bombshell, another rigorous search was made for Harrison's body, a search that included the cesspool in question, but this, like the earlier hunt, was completely unsuccessful. A strange incident from a few weeks before Harrison's disappearance was now recalled. One evening, John Perry was heard to cry out in the garden of Hicks estate. When some people came running to find the cause of this disturbance, they found Perry standing with a sheep pick in his hand. He claimed that two men in white had attacked him with swords. When asked about the incident, Perry now said that he had invented the story to make people think thieves were in the area. He hoped these fictional criminals would get the blame for the earlier burglary of Harrison's house, as well as his intended upcoming robbery. John claimed he had mutilated Harrison's hat and collar for the same reason. When Joan and Richard Perry were taken into custody, they vehemently denied their guilt and denounced John for implicating them in murder and burglary. However, he stuck to his damning story with equal vigor. At the next assizes, the trio was put on trial. In the courtroom, however, John Perry gave everyone a further surprise. Like his mother and brother, he pled not guilty, claiming that when he made his confession, he was then mad, and knew not what he said. Unfortunately, no records of the trial survive, so we are ignorant of what, if any, evidence other than John's now disowned confession was brought against the defendants. All we know is that the Perrys were found guilty and hanged. As Joan was believed to be a witch who had used her black arts to prevent John and Richard from confessing, she was executed first. The hope was that after she was dead, her sons would be free to admit their guilt. A contemporary account relates that while Richard stood on the scaffold, he professed, as he had done all along, that he was wholly innocent of the fact for which he was then to die, and that he knew nothing of Mr. Harrison's death, nor what was become of him, and did with great earnestness beg and beseech his brother, for the satisfaction of the whole world and his own conscience, to declare what he knew concerning him. When it was John's turn to die, he merely said with a dogged and surly carriage that he knew nothing of his master's death, nor what was become of him, but they might hereafter possibly hear. Everyone most certainly did hear what became of the steward, albeit a little late to be of any use to the Perrys. 2 years after his murder, William Harrison returned to Campden, alive and well. The story he gave to account for his disappearance is, amazingly, the most utterly unbelievable part of this already utterly unbelievable story. In brief, Harrison stated that while returning from his rent-collecting expedition, 2 men on horseback attacked him with swords and kidnapped him. They brought him to the port city of Deal, where they put him on a ship, which sailed off in a direction unknown to Harrison. During their voyage, the ship encountered 3 Turkish vessels. He was among the men captured by these ships, and Harrison was eventually sold as a slave to a physician in Smyrna. After about a year, his master died, leaving Harrison to shift for himself. He made his way to a nearby port, where he used a silver bowl from his ex-master's house to buy passage on a ship bound for Portugal. After they arrived in Lisbon, he encountered a fellow Englishman. This man took pity on Harrison's plight, gave him money, and arranged his passage on a ship heading for England. That, as far as we know, is the end of the tale of the Campden wonder, leaving generations of historians to scratch their heads and struggle to understand just what in hell happened. Harrison's story is, to say the least, unlikely, but we have absolutely no idea why he vanished, or where he was for 2 years. And why did John Perry condemn to death not only himself, but his mother and brother, for a murder that oh so obviously never took place? Despite close to 4 centuries of trying, no one has come up with satisfactory answers to these questions. All that can be said is that it's virtually certain no one ever will.